The film never showed what happens when power doesn't end in gunfire. No dramatic ambush. No final betrayal in a crowded restaurant. No cinematic justice. Instead, there was silence. A quiet room. A frail body. And a name that once carried weight across the American underworld, fading into irrelevance. Russell Bufalino. To the public, he was barely known. Even among crime historians, he remained a shadow, overshadowed by louder, flashier figures. Men like John Gotti, Carlo Gambino, or even Jimmy Hoffa dominated headlines and folklore. But according to multiple documented accounts, Bufalino was something far more dangerous. He wasn't loud. He wasn't reckless. He was invisible. And in the world of organized crime, invisibility meant survival. At least for a time. Russell Alberto Bufalino was born on October 29, 1903, in Monodoro, Sicily, a region steeped in poverty and tradition. Like many who would later shape American organized crime, his life began far from the streets he would eventually control. His family immigrated to the United States when he was still a child, settling in Pennsylvania. It was there, in the coal towns and industrial corridors, that Bufalino's worldview took shape. This wasn't New York. It wasn't Chicago. It was quieter, more rural, less scrutinized, perfect for someone who preferred to operate without attention. By the 1920s, Bufalino had already begun building connections within small but tightly knit Italian communities. These weren't just neighborhoods, they were ecosystems. Loyalty was everything. Outsiders were watched, and disputes were rarely settled in public. According to law enforcement reports from the era, Bufalino quickly demonstrated an unusual trait: patience. While others sought fast money through bootlegging and street-level rackets during Prohibition, Bufalino focused on relationships. He learned who to trust, who to eliminate, and most importantly, who to stay quiet around. This would become his greatest weapon. The rise of organized crime in America during the early 20th century created a new kind of criminal hierarchy. Families, not in the traditional sense, but structured organizations, each controlling territory, enforcing rules, and maintaining order through violence. In Pennsylvania and upstate New York, one such organization began to take shape: the Bufalino crime family. Though smaller than the infamous Five Families of New York, its influence stretched across labor unions, trucking routes, and rural rackets that were often ignored by federal authorities. That neglect worked in Bufalino's favor. He didn't need to dominate headlines. He needed control, and control came through subtlety. By the 1930s and 1940s, Bufalino had firmly established himself as a key figure in regional organized crime. He wasn't the type to order unnecessary killings or draw attention through flamboyant displays of power. Instead, he operated through intermediaries. Messages passed quietly, orders delivered indirectly. Even his closest associates rarely heard him raise his voice. But the calm exterior masked something far colder. Decisions were final. Disobedience was not tolerated, and consequences were rarely witnessed. One of the defining moments in Bufalino's ascent came through his connection to national crime networks. He wasn't isolated in Pennsylvania. He was connected, deeply. According to multiple documented accounts, Bufalino maintained relationships with some of the most powerful figures in American organized crime. These connections extended beyond regional operations and into national influence. Meetings weren't frequent, but when they happened, they mattered. One such gathering would later become infamous: the 1957 Appalachian Meeting in upstate New York, a summit of mafia leaders from across the country. Bufalino was there, and when law enforcement unexpectedly raided the meeting, dozens of high-ranking figures were detained or identified. It was one of the first major confirmations of a nationwide criminal syndicate. But even in that chaos, Bufalino remained composed. While others panicked, fled, or were caught in humiliating circumstances, he managed to avoid the kind of exposure that destroyed reputations. Investigators later noted how little they truly understood about him. He had been present, but he left behind almost nothing. No dramatic arrest, no incriminating statements, just another shadow slipping away. As the decades progressed, Bufalino's influence continued to grow, not through expansion, but through consolidation. He became known as a mediator, a man who could resolve disputes between powerful figures without escalating violence. This role elevated him beyond a regional boss. He became a quiet authority, someone whose approval or disapproval carried consequences far beyond Pennsylvania. But the truth was far darker, because mediation in organized crime is never neutral. It requires judgment, and judgment often requires choosing who lives and who disappears. By the 1960s, Bufalino had solidified his reputation as one of the most discreet and respected figures in the mafia hierarchy. But it was his connection to a man named Frank Sheeran that would later bring his story into public view. Sheeran, a truck driver turned enforcer, claimed to have worked closely with Bufalino for years. Through Sheeran's accounts, controversial and debated, Bufalino emerged as a central figure in some of the most mysterious events in American criminal history, including one that still remains unresolved: the disappearance of Jimmy Hoffa, a powerful labor union leader, a man with deep ties to organized crime, and a figure whose fate would become one of the greatest mysteries of the 20th century. According to Sheeran's testimony, Bufalino wasn't just involved. He was central, the decision-maker, the man who approved what others were too afraid to confront. But official records never confirmed these claims definitively. No body was ever found. No charges were successfully brought against Bufalino for Hoffa's disappearance. Still, the suspicion never faded. Investigators circled him for years, watching, waiting, trying to uncover what lay beneath the silence. Despite the growing attention from federal authorities, Bufalino remained remarkably insulated. He avoided wiretaps, minimized direct involvement, rarely appeared in places where deals were openly discussed. Even his lifestyle reflected this restraint. He lived modestly, dressed simply, avoided extravagance. There were no flashy cars, no public displays of wealth, nothing that would draw attention, because attention was dangerous. But by the early 1970s, the world around Bufalino was beginning to change. Law enforcement tactics were evolving. New legislation allowed prosecutors to target entire criminal organizations rather than isolated crimes. The Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, RICO, became a powerful tool. Suddenly, silence wasn't enough. Associations could be evidence, patterns could be prosecuted, and loyalty could be broken. For decades, Bufalino had relied on one unspoken rule: omerta, the code of silence. No one talked. No one cooperated. But that code was beginning to crack. Arrests were increasing. Sentences were longer. And some men were starting to reconsider their loyalty. Still, Bufalino remained confident. He had survived prohibition. He had survived national investigations. He had survived decades of internal conflict without ever becoming a target. Or so it seemed, because behind the scenes, something was shifting. Quietly, gradually, inevitably. In 1976, Bufalino was convicted on extortion charges related to a labor dispute. It wasn't a headline-grabbing case, but it marked a turning point. For the first time in decades, the silent king of Pennsylvania was no longer untouchable. He was sentenced to prison, and though the sentence itself was relatively short, the implications were far greater. Because prison changes things. It weakens control. It creates opportunities for rivals. And most dangerously, it exposes vulnerabilities. While Bufalino served his time, the organization he had carefully maintained began to feel the pressure. Not for violence, but from uncertainty. Who was in charge? Who was making decisions? And more importantly, who might start talking? According to investigators, this period marked the beginning of a slow but irreversible shift. Not a collapse. Not yet. But a fracture. One that would widen over time. When Bufalino was eventually released, he returned to a world that was no longer entirely under his control. The structures were still there. The loyalty remained, on the surface. But something had changed, and he knew it. Because in organized crime, power isn't just about authority. It's about perception. And once that perception begins to weaken, everything else follows. Behind closed doors, conversations became quieter. Meetings became less frequent. Decisions were no longer unquestioned. And somewhere within that silence, doubt began to grow. But the most dangerous threat wasn't external. It wasn't law enforcement. It wasn't rival families. It was something far closer, something internal. Because according to multiple documented accounts, one of the men closest to Russell Bufalino was about to become the key to everything unraveling. And when that shift finally revealed itself, it wouldn't come with violence. It would come with words. It would come with words. Not bullets. Not bloodshed in the streets. Not a violent coup from within. Just words spoken in the wrong place to the wrong people. And once they were said, there was no taking them back. By the late 1970s, the structure of organized crime in America was undergoing a transformation. The old rules still existed, but they were weakening. For decades, men like Russell Bufalino had relied on silence as their greatest defense. The Code of Omerta wasn't just tradition, it was survival. But federal prosecutors had found a way around it. They didn't need confessions anymore. They needed patterns. They needed connections. And with the expansion of RICO prosecutions, those connections were becoming easier to prove. According to multiple documented accounts, law enforcement agencies began focusing less on individual crimes and more on entire networks. And Bufalino's network, though quiet, was extensive. At the center of that network were men who had built their lives around loyalty. Truck drivers, union officials, enforcers, intermediaries, men who had followed orders without question for decades. But prison had changed things. Long sentences, isolated cells, the growing realization that loyalty wasn't always reciprocated. Some began to reconsider, and one of those men stood closer to Bufalino than most. Frank Sheeran, a name that would later become inseparable from Bufalino's legacy. A war veteran turned labor union official. A man who moved between legitimate business and organized crime with unsettling ease. According to his own accounts, Sheeran had carried out violent assignments on Bufalino's behalf, quietly, efficiently, without hesitation. For years, he had been trusted, perhaps more than anyone else. And that trust would become the most dangerous liability of all. The film portrayed their relationship as deeply personal, almost familial, but the truth was far more complex. Because in organized crime, trust is never unconditional. It is transactional, maintained only as long as it serves a purpose. As federal pressure intensified, investigators began closing in on figures connected to labor unions, particularly those tied to pension funds and transportation networks. These were not small operations. They were financial lifelines, and Bufalino's influence within them had been carefully cultivated over decades. But that influence left a trail, and investigators were beginning to follow it. Wiretaps became more sophisticated. Surveillance became more patient. Agents were no longer looking for dramatic evidence. They were building cases slowly, piece by piece, and they were waiting for a crack. According to investigators later involved in organized crime prosecutions, that crack often came from within, not from bosses, from soldiers, men who had less to gain and more to lose. Frank Sheeran was not immediately seen as a weak link. He had a reputation for reliability, for silence, but time has a way of altering even the most disciplined minds, especially when the consequences become personal. By the early 1980s, Sheeran's legal troubles began to mount. Convictions related to labor racketeering and fraud placed him directly in the path of long-term imprisonment. And unlike Bufalino, Sheeran did not have the same level of insulation. He was exposed. According to multiple documented accounts, this is where the dynamic began to shift. Quietly, subtly, but irreversibly. Because for the first time, the question wasn't about loyalty to the organization. It was about survival. At the same time, law enforcement strategies were becoming more aggressive. Prosecutors began offering deals, reduced sentences in exchange for cooperation, protection programs for those willing to testify. For decades, these offers had been ignored, refused, seen as betrayal. But now, they were being considered. The silence was weakening. Meanwhile, Bufalino continued to operate as he always had. Cautious, reserved, detached. He avoided direct conversations about illegal activity, delegated decisions, maintained distance from operations that could be traced back to him. On the surface, nothing had changed. But beneath that surface, everything was shifting. Investigators later discovered that during this period, communication within the organization became fragmented. Messages were no longer as clear. Chains of command became less defined, and uncertainty began to spread. For a man like Bufalino, this was dangerous, not because it threatened his authority directly, but because it introduced unpredictability. And unpredictability leads to mistakes. One of the most significant areas of concern remained the disappearance of Jimmy Hoffa. Years had passed since Hoffa vanished in 1975, but the investigation had never truly closed. It lingered, a shadow over everyone connected to him, and Bufalino's name, though never formally charged, remained in the periphery of that investigation. According to Sheeran's later claims, the decision to eliminate Hoffa had been made at the highest levels. Approved, sanctioned, final. But these claims would only emerge years later. At the time, they remained unspoken, locked behind the same silence that had protected Bufalino for decades. Until that silence began to fracture, investigators intensified their focus on individuals who had once been considered untouchable. They revisited old cases, re-examined witness statements, cross-referenced financial records, and slowly, a clearer picture began to form. Not a single crime, but of an entire system. A system in which Bufalino had played a central role. And then, the conversations began. According to law enforcement records, several individuals connected to organized crime families across the country began providing information. Not always complete, not always consistent, but enough to build momentum, enough to create pressure. The effect was immediate. Paranoia spread. Meetings became rare. Trust deteriorated. Bufalino, who had spent decades maintaining control through calm authority, now faced something he had rarely encountered: uncertainty. Because the rules were no longer clear, the code of silence was no longer absolute, and the question that lingered behind every interaction was simple: who might talk next? Frank Sheeran's position during this time became increasingly complicated. He was no longer just an associate. He was a liability, a man with knowledge, with connections, with history. According to multiple documented accounts, Sheeran never officially testified against Bufalino in a courtroom, but his later statements, recorded in interviews and memoirs, would paint a picture that investigators had long suspected: a picture of quiet authority, of decisions made without witnesses, of power exercised without visibility. And while these revelations came years after Bufalino's peak, their impact was retroactive. They reshaped how his entire career was understood. But in the moment, during the late 1970s and early 1980s, none of this had fully surfaced. What existed instead was pressure, relentless, growing pressure. Law enforcement wasn't looking for a single mistake anymore. They were waiting for accumulation, for enough fragments to form a case that couldn't be ignored. And that moment was approaching, because despite his caution, despite decades of avoiding exposure, Bufalino had begun to appear in places he once avoided. Associations that could be traced, conversations that could be monitored, movements that could be documented. Individually, they meant nothing, but together, they formed a pattern. And under RICO statutes, patterns were everything. In 1981, Bufalino was indicted again, this time connected to a broader investigation into organized crime activities. The charges weren't dramatic, but they were strategic, part of a larger effort to dismantle entire networks. This wasn't about a single crime. It was about proving a lifetime of influence. Bufalino, now aging, faced a reality he had avoided for decades. The system he had navigated so carefully had changed, and it was no longer designed to overlook men like him. The trial process was slow, deliberate, built on layers of evidence rather than singular events. And for the first time, the possibility of a true downfall began to take shape. Not through violence, not through betrayal in the traditional sense, but through exposure. Because once the system begins to see you clearly, you can no longer remain invisible. And for Russell Bufalino, invisibility had always been his greatest defense. Now it was gone. As proceedings advanced and pressure mounted, the organization he once controlled with quiet precision began to distance itself. Not openly, not dramatically, but enough to be felt. Calls went unanswered. Meetings were postponed. Decisions were made without him. Power was shifting, and it was happening without confrontation. Because in organized crime, the most decisive changes are often the quietest. By the time the legal process reached its critical stage, Bufalino was no longer the untouchable figure he once had been. He was something else, something far more vulnerable. A man being watched, documented, measured, And as the weight of decades finally began to close in around him, the outcome was no longer a question of if, but when. Because the silence that had protected Russell Bufalino for a lifetime had finally been broken. And what followed next would not just end his control, it would erase everything he had built. It would erase everything he had built, not in a single moment. Not with the kind of dramatic collapse that defined so many other figures in organized crime. There would be no public spectacle, no violent overthrow, no final act of defiance, just a slow dismantling, measured, methodical, unavoidable. By the early 1980s, the shift was complete. Russell Bufalino was no longer operating from a position of quiet dominance. He was reacting, and for a man who had spent decades controlling outcomes, that change was profound. Investigators had what they needed, not a confession, not a single defining piece of evidence, but something far more effective, a pattern. Under RICO statutes, prosecutors no longer needed to prove that Bufalino had personally committed specific crimes. They only needed to demonstrate that he had been part of a criminal enterprise and that his actions contributed to its operation. And after decades of surveillance, testimony, and cross-referenced records, that case had finally taken shape. According to multiple documented accounts, Bufalino's later legal battles were less about shocking revelations and more about confirmation. Law enforcement had suspected his role for years. Now they could articulate it. The proceedings were deliberate. There was no rush, because time was no longer on Bufalino's side. He was aging. His influence was weakening, and the network that had once shielded him was no longer intact. Former associates had distanced themselves. Some had already faced their own prosecutions. Others had simply disappeared from the structure altogether. The cohesion that once defined the organization was gone. Investigators later noted that this fragmentation was one of the most critical factors in Bufalino's downfall. Not betrayal in the traditional sense, but absence, a lack of reinforcement, a lack of protection, because power in organized crime is never held alone. It is sustained collectively, and when that collective begins to dissolve, even the most disciplined leaders become exposed. Bufalino's later convictions reflected this reality. They weren't tied to a single violent act. They were tied to years of association, years of quiet decisions, years of influence that could now be traced. In 1982, he was convicted again on federal charges. The sentence, while not extraordinary in length, carried a different weight. It wasn't just punishment. It was confirmation. The silent figure who had avoided scrutiny for decades had finally been defined. Not by myth, not by speculation, but by documented history. And yet, even in conviction, Bufalino remained consistent. He did not speak. He did not cooperate. He did not attempt to negotiate his way out through testimony. The code of silence held, even at the end. But the world around him had already moved on. By the time Bufalino entered the final phase of his life, the structure of organized crime in America had changed dramatically. The old hierarchies still existed, but they were weakened. Federal prosecutions had dismantled entire networks. High-profile convictions had reshaped leadership across multiple families. And the era of quiet, insulated power was coming to an end. Bufalino, once a master of that system, no longer fit within it. According to investigators and historians, his final years were marked not by control, but by isolation. He was no longer central to decision-making, no longer a mediator, no longer a figure whose approval determined outcomes. He was peripheral. This transition did not happen publicly. There was no announcement, no formal removal, just a gradual absence from the conversations that once defined his authority. And in organized crime, absence is everything. The man who had once resolved disputes between powerful figures was no longer consulted. The man who had once influenced national decisions was no longer informed. His power hadn't been taken. It had simply faded. Investigators later described this phase as a quiet retirement, though the term hardly captures the reality. Because retirement suggests choice, this was something else. It was irrelevance. The film never showed this part. There were no scenes of decline, no depiction of the slow erosion of influence, no portrayal of a man watching the world he controlled continue without him. But according to multiple documented accounts, that is exactly what happened. Bufalino spent his final years largely removed from the structures he had built. His health declined, his presence diminished, and the network that once operated around him adapted without requiring his involvement. Meanwhile, the questions that had surrounded his life remained unanswered. Jimmy Hoffa's disappearance continued to dominate public curiosity. Investigators revisited the case repeatedly. New theories emerged. New claims surfaced. Among them were the accounts attributed to Frank Sheeran, claims that placed Bufalino at the center of the decision, the final authority. But these claims, while widely discussed, were never conclusively proven in a court of law. No physical evidence, no definitive closure, just a narrative supported by fragments. And in a way, that uncertainty mirrored Bufalino himself, a man defined not by what was proven, but by what was understood. On February 25, 1994, Russell Bufalino died in a nursing home in Pennsylvania. He was 90 years old. There was no major headline, no national spectacle, no public reckoning. His death passed quietly, much like his life. And yet, his influence had shaped decades of organized crime, not through visibility, but through absence. He had avoided the spotlight, avoided the headlines, avoided the kind of notoriety that destroyed others. But in the end, that same invisibility became his final legacy. Because without visibility, there is no story, no clear beginning, no defined end, just fragments, connections, and unanswered questions. Investigators would later reflect on Bufalino as one of the most elusive figures they had ever encountered. Not because he was the most violent, not because he was the most powerful, but because he was the hardest to define. He left behind no recordings of incriminating conversations, no public statements of authority, no dramatic evidence that could fully encapsulate his role. Only patterns, only associations, only silence. And that silence is what ultimately allowed him to exist for so long. But it is also what ensured that his story would never be fully told. The film showed fragments, moments, interpretations, but the truth was far darker. Because Russell Bufalino did not fall in the way most powerful men do. He wasn't overthrown. He wasn't assassinated. He wasn't exposed in a single defining moment. He was forgotten, not entirely, but enough. His name remains in records, in investigations, in the margins of one of America's greatest unsolved mysteries. But the man himself, the decisions he made, the full extent of his influence, all of it, faded into silence. And in the end, that silence wasn't just protection. It was erasure.